the world of politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
From the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew.
Chicago! It's good to be home. It is good to be home, and I don't know about you, but I'm feeling fired up.
Sounds and sights from Chicago last night. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power, live from Chicago on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. Having heard from the former President Barack Obama, the former First Lady Michelle Obama, I think the room full of delegates still recovering from that night that we saw.
Yeah, of course, two of the most popular figures in Democratic politics, but that was not all. We also heard from the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, who spoke about his wife, Kamala Harris, even though she herself was not present in the convention hall last night, having gone with Tim Walz to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, filling the Pfizer Forum where the RNC was held last month with 18,000 people. And, of course, it will be Tim Walz in his turn in the spotlight tonight. She
made a brief appearance on the video screen.
Yeah.
People are getting a little bit of Kamala Harris before the big speech. This one, of course, day three, a fight for our freedoms.
Yes.
The theme, Kaylee, if that matters to anyone, but of course, the headliner tonight is going to be her running mate, Tim Walz.
Yeah, we'll also hear from former President Bill Clinton, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. There is a very long list of speakers slotted for this evening. So let's get the latest now and a recap of last night with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who has eyes on the United Center here in Chicago. Tyler.
Yeah, hey, Kaylee. Last night was actually the first time that we heard from former President Barack Obama since President Joe Biden decided to drop out of the 2024 race. His speech last night was largely seen as this transition moment here at the Democratic National Convention, from President Biden's speech on Monday night to now introducing voters to this new Democratic ticket. I want you to take a listen here to former President Obama last night on the convention floor, addressing everybody and signaling that this is a new era for the Democratic Party.
The torch has been passed. Now it is up to all of us to fight for the America we believe in, for all the incredible energy we've been able to generate over the last few weeks, for all the rallies and the memes. This will still be a tight race in a closely divided country.
Both the former president and former First Lady Michelle Obama, who also spoke, tried to emphasize the newfound energy Kamala Harris's groundbreaking candidacy as the first woman of color presidential nominee is bringing to voters. But as you heard, they also warned this is expected to be a very close race, using the moment to deliver pointed criticism of former President Donald Trump, too, as Harris tries to build this broad coalition of support in her relatively new campaign. This through line that we're watching is this desire to prevent a second Trump term, whether that's been from moderates, progressives, or even former Republicans that we've seen on stage at the Democratic National Convention. Now, Joe and Kaylee, looking ahead to tonight, we know that now Minnesota Governor Tim Walz will officially accept his vice presidential nomination when he takes the stage and introduces himself to voters here tonight.
It's going to be a big night. Of course, Tyler will bring us inside the hall a little bit later on and see how things are shaping up on the floor of the convention on day three. Tyler Kendall, thank you so much, as always. Joining us now, Bloomberg Economics' Stephanie Flanders, to talk about what, of course, is the overriding issue in this campaign, and one that we haven't necessarily heard enough about, Kaylee, when it comes to details. Thanks for being with us. It's great to see you in Chicago.
Good to see you.
If that is true, if the economy is the #1 issue in this campaign, are these candidates saying enough?
Well, I mean, certainly this week is not a week. The convention week is never a great one for policy wonks.
I guess that's true.
And I think this one probably more than usual, because there's so much focus on building up the vibes for Kamala Harris, and also sort of fleshing out her vision, firing up the troops, all the usual things. But I do think you saw, even last week in her speech in North Carolina, she's trying to do that slightly difficult pivot from the Biden-Harris ticket, where the perception was they were too often telling voters they ought to feel better about the economy than they actually were. There was a bit of that in her speech, but I think she was also trying to feel the pain of people who feel that their energy bills and their food bills are still too high, and propose some concrete things. I think what she talked about, she has focused on housing. That is a big issue for people. She has seem reasonably credible proposals on that. I think more populist, certainly less popular with economists. Yeah. Her talk of price gouging, having price controls on for groceries and other things, and following Donald Trump in this rather odd policy of exempting tips from tax. So I think we've seen hints of a pivot away, a focus on the unfinished business of the Biden administration economically, but as you say, a lot more to do, because that's one of the issues people were not really feeling it on.
Yeah. Well, and you key in on housing specifically. That's actually something that former President Obama addressed in his remarks last night. Here's a taste.
If we want to make it easier for more young people to buy a home, we need to build more units and clear away some of the outdated laws and regulations that made it harder to build homes for working people in this country. That is a priority, and she's put out a bold new plan to do just that.
But part of the plan she's put out, obviously, including the down payment assistance for first-time homebuyers, has been criticized, to your point, about potentially being something that could be deficit additive and therefore potentially cause more economic problems realistically than it solves. We've seen criticism in that regard, frankly, for both of these campaigns. Donald Trump for tax cuts that also could be added to the deficit, inflationary policy pursuits broadly. Is there a real difference in the outcome for the economy, no matter who wins, even if they get about it a different way?
I mean, one difference is there is a commitment. So far, Kamala Harris has signed up to the sort of Biden budget proposals for next year. Not that they ever mean very much, but you know, there is a plan which involves the corporate tax increase, 28%. Which supposedly is offsetting some of the spending increases. Doesn't offset these new spending proposals that she put forward last week. But I think most economists would say that the least sustainable path that we're seeing from the two candidates would be Donald Trump's, because he wants to make permanent that enormous tax cut in the past few years and has said nothing really concrete about spending reductions. But on the housing side, I think the key thing, you know, there's always a challenge, right? It's for a chunk of a huge chunk of the voters, it's their main source of wealth. But for another big chunk, it's their main expense, the main thing they struggle with. And how do you bring down the cost without also feeling like you're hitting people's wealth? So that's why I think that two-sided approach she has actually does make some sense, a real focus on increasing the supply, the baby build, along with the sort of pushing to home.
Have they heard that? You need to send that to them. That's good material.
I don't think that's
Let me just ask you the same question slightly differently. Are we sitting here in Chicago making too much of a deal and too much of an assumption that the next president of the United States can actually have enough influence against the forces of the marketplace to control inflation?
Well, I think there's certainly
one person.
There's one concrete thing which a president can do to contribute to inflation, and that is impose a tariff on all imported goods.
So the prospect of making it worse is more likely than making it better.
But I think you make a good point that it is very much down to the Federal Reserve, and there have been some question marks about whether a Trump 2.0 would respect the independence of Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve, and that's something we're definitely watching.
Yeah, and of course, as this convention week coincides with Jackson Hole, and we're all waiting to hear from Jerome Powell on Friday. Bloomberg's Stephanie Flanders, thank you so much for joining us. Now, while the markets await Chairman Powell and are paying close attention to every word spoken out of Jackson Hole, here in Chicago, everyone was captivated last night by every word spoken by the former president, Barack Obama. Here's some more of what he said.
We believe that true freedom gives each of us the right to make decisions about our own life, how we worship, what our family looks like, how many kids we have, who we marry. And we believe that freedom requires us to recognize that other people have the freedom to make choices that are different than ours. That's okay. If a parent or grandparent occasionally says something that makes us cringe, we don't automatically assume they're bad people. We recognize that the world is moving fast, that they need time and maybe a little encouragement to catch up. Our fellow citizens deserve the same grace, we hope they'll extend to us. The ties that bind us together are still there. We still coach Little League and look out for our elderly neighbors. We still feed the hungry in churches and mosques and synagogues and temples. We share the same pride when our Olympic athletes compete for the gold. Because the vast majority of us do not want to live in a country that's bitter and divided. We want something better.
Joining us now for more on what we heard last night and what we have yet to hear on this night, night 3, and of course, ultimately night 4 of the Democratic National Convention here in Chicago is Brad Howard. He is Corcoran Street Group founder and a Democratic strategist here with us on set. Always good to see you here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Brad. We heard from both of the Obamas yesterday what felt like a message, and not a veiled one, about the risk of complacency. This idea that this very much is still going to be a fight, despite all of the enthusiasm about Harris's candidacy. How does the party turn the enthusiasm that's being felt here in Chicago into actual votes?
Yeah, I think
November?
The beauty of the Obama coalition was always that you may not agree with me 100% of the time on all of the issues, but there's a lot at stake, and you've got to vote. And I think they're carrying that message through now to this newer generation who may not agree with 100% of everything that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz take a position on, but that doesn't mean you should stay at home. It doesn't mean you should sit on the couch. It means that you've got to look at the alternatives that are presented to you and which vision is more like the vision you want for the future of America. And I think they are so good at making that case to young voters in particular and voters of color who often feel disenfranchised by our politics. I think you are seeing a beautiful consolidation of the base of those two entities. You know, we've got protests here at the Chicago, but even last night, you've seen folks, Doug, reaching out to them and people mentioning the protests. Like, we welcome this dissenting voice within the Democratic Party because we are a Big Ten party. Take that energy, though, and put it into victory in November, because what's at stake is if you really care about the Palestinian people, Donald Trump is going to do no good. And so, you've got to really get on board here and come and unite and defeat Donald Trump in November.
Well, there was a bit of nostalgia in the room last night.
Oh, yeah,
as
man.
Democrats remembered what it was like to live.
What it was like to really hear a speech.
Look, yeah, I think a lot of memories came back for some folks. It was not just Barack Obama. It was former First Lady Michelle Obama, who also spoke to the delegates. Let's listen.
A familiar feeling that's been buried too deep for far too long. You know what I'm talking about. It's the contagious power of hope.
Indeed, talking about being on the cusp of a brighter day. There were some reportedly in the Biden camp bristled a little bit, thinking that she was maybe lumping the Biden administration into the Trump, then just kind of 8 years of whatever that was, not noting the continuation of hope maybe that Joe Biden brought. It's pretty hard to project this new feeling of optimism without making a commentary on what's just passed.
Well, I think look, we are extremely grateful for Joe Biden for what he did in 2020 in defeating Donald Trump and bringing us out of one of the worst economic conditions this country had ever faced in a global pandemic. But at the same time, too, putting a period to Joe Biden's incredible legacy also feels like we're closing the chapter on Donald Trump, right? We're trying to do the same thing here. And so I think what she's saying is there are a lot of people that still feel like we haven't fully emerged from the pandemic, that there's still elements of that toxic politics, the conspiracy-driven agenda, that all the folks are still trying to blame various people on the pandemic when voters want to look to the future. And I think the case they're making last night is we are moving past this point. We're putting a period on that effort and those times, and we are looking to a bright new future. Donald Trump's going to send you back into that chaos of the past. We are now offering you an alternative, fresh, new vision for the future that's full of hope and unity, and not the divisive politics of one individual who's got a litany of cases he wants to bring in terms of retaliatory measures.
Well, as we think about the attacks that Donald Trump has now lobbed at this new ticket of Harris and Walz, in part, especially when Walz was selected, it was a criticism that he is ultra-liberal, dangerously so, is their characterization, that he is incredibly progressive. How do you think, with that criticism in mind, he's going to present himself to America tonight? Is he going to try to bring back some of his progressive policies as governor of Minnesota, or focus on his career as a legislator, where he was more in the middle?
I think he's going to do both, because no matter what has even though his positions may have changed a little bit over time, his values have not. And when Tim Walz is a pro-family Democrat, he was a pro-family member of Congress, he was a pro-family governor, he is going to be a pro-family vice president, and this is going to be one of the most pro-family tickets in the history of modern American politics. And so I think what you're going to see is just telling voters who he is. And I think once you understand Tim Walz, you understand his values. And his values are what's going to guide him in his vice presidency as he helps to enact Kamala Harris's vision. And these two together represent two, I think, very, uniquely American upbringings and pieces of society at the moment. A Midwestern dad who, really tried very hard to have a family, got his family, coached football, just what you would expect, flannel-wearing Midwestern dad, and a woman of color who clawed her way through adversity to come up and grew up in a place like California. These are two very different stories that coming together, showing Americans that you can be very different backgrounds and yet work together. And that's something we're going to see.
You mentioned the protesters, Brad. We haven't seen what many folks predicted. Tens of thousands facing off with police. There was a bit of a skirmish last evening outside the city's Israeli consulate. We saw about a dozen protesters detained. Is that what you expected? How come this isn't coming to fruition?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think number one, Joe Biden's the one making the decisions. I think had he been the nominee, you probably would have had more of a pressure campaign to do so. But I think so, yeah. I think Kamala has shown an ability to tell these protesters that she's wants to hear from them, but also this is her time. Like, let her tell her story. We will have times to have these conversations. And I think Democrats are all united behind peace in the Middle East and about bringing the hostages home. There's differences on how we do that, and those will be played out. But also, too, Chicago PD, you got to give them credit. They know how to handle large crowds. They know how to handle protesters. They've done a wonderful job. There have been a few skirmishes and things that we could have done a little differently. But all in all, I think the protesters are feeling heard and acknowledged by the convention speakers, and I think that is critical, too.
And finally, we only have a minute left, Brad, but it's been a pretty stacked first 3 nights. It will be another stacked 3 nights. People that you would think maybe would introduce Kamala Harris have already spoken or are going to speak this evening. Who is worthy of introducing the nominee on Thursday?
Give us some news.
Yeah, well, we're going to see. But, I'm excited tonight to hear from Bill Clinton. I'm from Arkansas, Arkansas boy. Bill Clinton is the best messenger Democrats have on the economy. I think you're going to see him talk about that tonight. I'm super excited to have him put into stark contrast because right now, I think the polling is showing that Trump has a slight lead on the economy, though Kamala's overtaking him. She's rolled out her economic plan last week. I think you're going to see a really strong pitch on the economy, and we're going to steal that away from the Republicans and win in November on it.
Great to see you in Chicago.
Thank you.
Meet you back home in D.C. Brad Howard, Corcoran Street Group, Democratic strategist, setting us up here for night 3. We thank you as always. I thought he was going to say Beyonce. There's no.
Yeah, I'm trying to get the Beyonce news.
And Taylor Swift.
I want to break that for you here on Bloomberg.
Straight ahead, San Francisco Mayor London Breed, Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. It is day 3, turning into night 3. This is the evening when we will hear from the vice presidential nominee, Governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, as he makes his formal acceptance of the nomination. We'll be hearing from a number of other high-profile speakers, including another former president, Bill Clinton, tonight, after we heard from former President Barack Obama last night, Jeff.
They'll be upping the ante here as each night goes by, although I think for a lot of the delegates in the room, it's going to be tough to beat the Obama speeches, the First Lady and the former president last evening. But you know who else we're going to hear from tonight is Nancy Pelosi, who played a pretty major role in the development of this campaign over the last several weeks, and her message is going to be pretty important for that room, too.
Yeah, especially whether or not she perhaps talks about the incumbent president, Joe Biden, given the behind-the-scenes role we understood she played in the actual pushing him out of his re-election campaign. She, of course, one of the still most powerful figures in Democratic politics.
As we seize upon the voice of San Francisco, not just Nancy Pelosi, but the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed, is in Chicago, part of this convention, and with us right now at the table. Mayor, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
You have known Kamala Harris for a long time. You've been friends for 20 years outside of politics. You know this candidate, this nominee, better than most people who we're going to talk with this week. And I understand that she's had wonderful advice for you over the years. I wonder what your advice is for her at this convention on Thursday night.
Wow. Me give Kamala Harris advice? I'm not used to that one.
As only a friend could.
Yeah, but the one thing I would say, when she is herself and giving it her all and speaking from the heart, there is nothing like it. She is strong, she is firm, she is committed to doing this work, but also she's a very compassionate person who deeply cares about justice and taking care of people, and she's proven that time and time again with the work that she's done over the years.
Well, certainly she's leaned into her past experience as a prosecutor. Of course, she was the DA of San Francisco before she became Attorney General of the state of California. And we've heard different iterations on the stage last night of this election being something of a prosecutor up against a felon. How hard do you expect her to lean into that image, knowing that for some segments of the Democratic coalition especially, it may actually be a bit problematic?
Well, I think it's important for her to talk about the work that she did. So not only did she prosecute people in San Francisco when we were dealing with the height of gun violence, I mean, she prosecuted people who committed murder. And it's important to make it clear that she was basically not holding any bars and doing that work. But at the same time, people who were in jail for small offenses, her Back on Track program provided a second chance at life as long as people were willing to put in the work to get through the program. So I think that you could support both. She wrote a book about it. She said it's not about being tough on crime. It's not about being soft on crime, but it's about being smart on crime and making sure that there's fairness, there's justice, and there's balance.
Well, to stick with that theme for a moment, you have something in common with this city of Chicago in that you are held up, San Francisco, Chicago, by Republicans on a regular basis as an example of what is wrong with progressive politics when it comes to crime. I know that you've tried to make strides in San Francisco, and how do you message that to people when you're hearing so much from the other side?
Well, we have made strides. And in fact, San Francisco has one of the lowest crime rates of any major city in the country. This is the lowest crime rate we've had in over a decade. And not to mention, we are on track to have even one of the lowest homicide rates we've had in the history of our city. So when you fact check and you look at the data and look at actually what's happening in San Francisco, people will be surprised. When I talk to other mayors, they're like, I wish I had those kind of small, big city problems. And the data doesn't lie. And I think if people look deep into what is going on in San Francisco, they'll see that it is one of the safest cities in the country.
Of course, it's not just about crime, though. It's about the wider issue of homelessness, too. You yourself have called for tough love when it comes to the notion of clearing out tent encampments, for example. Is that tough love working? What about progress on that front?
Yeah, it's been challenging, but since I've been in office, we've helped over 15,000 people exit homelessness. We've never even had a point-in-time account with, more than like 8,000 or so people. So it's been really a tough struggle, but we also have to make sure when people are rejecting what we're offering in terms of services, we are now no longer just leaving them out on the streets, and we're being a lot more aggressive. To a certain extent, it's working because more people are accepting help, but there is still a really tough group of people, mostly tragically because of drug use, that's having an impact. We're still struggling with that point, but we're still making progress. The streets look better, it looks cleaner. We have one neighborhood that continues to experience more challenges than others. But when you come to San Francisco and you drive around our city and you look around our city, people are always like, what is everyone talking about? So you got to come see it for yourself and then check the facts in terms of the data as to what really is happening in San Francisco.
Well, if we can hold on to the issue of housing more broadly here, this is a big deal for this campaign and for this economy right now. And I know for a fact that that's not new for you. You've actually made this a major issue for you as a city official, as a commissioner, as mayor. Taking different ideas, experimental ideas, to see what can be done to create more housing. I know that there's an effort to get people to a point where they can afford a first-time home, but you need something to move into. You've suggested a lot of different ideas and tried them out, like converting empty public housing, for instance, city housing, city buildings, rather. What advice do you have for the campaign that could be a national model to create more housing in this country?
Well, Kamala Harris said it on the stage to say getting rid of the red tape that makes it difficult to produce housing. And fortunately in California, that just happened with a bill that was passed by the state legislature led by Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco. And that bill will allow housing to be as of right. If the zoning already allows for you to do 4, 6, 8 stories, why is there so many obstacles that are able to get in the way, and now that won't happen as long as you're following what the existing laws are.
Like parking requirements, for instance?
Yes,
You got to that in San Francisco.
Definitely. We could have those or not have those. We're making our city more of a transit-first city, as well as protected bike lanes, allowing different modes of transportation to thrive in our city. So it's all of the above, and bureaucratic red tape is at the heart of the challenges that exist. And I love the fact that our vice president, soon to be president, put that at the forefront of the conversation, and California is already leading the way.
Well, certainly she has to, at the forefront of the conversation, have these notions of the economy, knowing it ranks so highly consistently in polls as the top issue for voters. Another issue that ranks highly, though, is the border and migration. You hear frequently in the Republican camp that every state, every city is now effectively a border city. How do you view that issue when it comes not just to the city of San Francisco, but the state of California as a whole, and what the appropriate, if we're going with a tough love kind of message here, way is to deal with migration and the border?
Well, it's important for them to implement the plan that they're talking about to make sure that there's a significant level of accountability. But I also want to be very clear, because it's not just one thing. It's not just about people. It's also about substances. And in fact, the National Guard, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the U.S. Attorney's Office, who's working with us locally, and including our state representatives, the California Highway Patrol, the National Guard, they are all collaborating on using technology in a way that is, making arrests at the border for the illegal fentanyl that continues to come into cities like San Francisco. And so that aggressive effort using technology can help us address those issues, in addition to the challenges with people who are coming over the border. I believe that Kamala Harris is the right person to implement a really tough strategy, but also a compassionate and understanding one, especially because it is so complicated in that we are a country built on immigrants. And so we have to make sure that we're balancing that as well.
You say that she's the right person, and yet, and I'm sure you've heard this frequently in the last several weeks, Republicans argue she was put in charge of the border issue. Maybe not given the actual border czar title, but this was an issue she was supposed to own as vice president. She has been vice president for over 3.5 years. If she couldn't get control of it then, how are we supposed to believe she could get control of it when she's actually sitting in the Oval Office herself? Well,
here's the thing. Control means different things. And I go back to my experience of the control around illegal substances that are making it across the border. The number of arrests, the number of drugs that have been confiscated as a result of the efforts of the White House, of the federal partners that I mentioned earlier, has yielded significant results. And I believe that that component of what they're doing even now has been impactful and will continue to be more impactful. In terms of some of the other challenges, they have to continue to make sure that there's, a push. I mean, everyone's talking about a wall of this and a wall of that. A wall is not going to, continuously keep people out. The goal is to try and get a better control over the border and making sure that we're implementing the right policies and being fair and equitable in our strategies, and developing better relationships with the countries, in order to help support them so that we don't experience this challenge of everyone trying to, flee from a particular location to get into the United States. That's a big part of it as well.
What would happen to California's workforce and economy if Donald Trump did become the next president and shut down the border, as he says? If you had no immigration in the workforce, could your economy sustain itself?
Well, I don't believe so. I think immigration is an important part of, how our society works, and we need to make sure that we're balancing that with the needs of the people that we're here to serve. And ultimately, we're seeing some incredible opportunities within the job markets all over the state of California, and our goal is to do everything we can to balance that. But going back to some of the illegal activities around the drugs. That is the thing that is harming our economy the most, and that is the thing that is important to focus on as we continue to move in this direction.
Well, if you listen to Donald Trump, he has said repeatedly that he actually thinks the economic problem with migration, in part, is that migrants are coming to this country and they're taking black jobs. He said this on multiple occasions, and it was certainly noted by the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, last night.
Who's going to tell him that the job he's currently seeking might just be one of those black jobs?
One of those moments I think we've all seen on social media a lot in the last 12 hours, certainly. But she, of course, was on that stage speaking as a Black woman, and a powerful one at that, someone who was the First Lady of the United States, speaking on behalf of another woman of color who is now the Democratic nominee and will be formally accepting it on Thursday. You yourself are a woman of color as well. And I wonder, as we consider the historic nature of this candidacy, how the appropriate way to talk about that is, especially in the face of language like we're hearing from Donald Trump. Do you address it head on or do you ignore it?
Well, I think you address it head on, and I think it has been addressed. For example, implying somehow that Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate. And I mean, it's unbelievable when you look at her qualifications of her, just look at her resume in comparison to his. There is no comparison. She wasn't born into privilege. She worked really hard to get a law degree on her own, to really fight for a number of positions that she ran for, and to push for the kinds of policies that have helped to support Americans and the rights of women, LGBTQ community, and so on and so forth. I can go on, but you know, that's one of the challenges that sometimes, you know, women and women of color have is, well, how did you get there? It must have been someone else. And, you know, to be very clear, you know, when the man goes through a same process, that doesn't get questioned. And I think that's kind of the frustrating part of this, which is why I love being a part of the Democratic Party, because you see people who are elevating women. You see many men who spoke last night at the DNC, you know, highlighting Kamala Harris in such an extraordinary way. And I'm really proud, and it's no comparison. I think it's important for us to remind the American people, not just of her qualifications, but why is this a race in the first place in light of what Donald Trump has done to really, you know, create a huge barrier in this country overall, with his policies, with his pushes, with his lies, with his disrespect and his divisiveness. There should not be a question, but we are going to continue to elevate Kamala Harris and do everything we can to ensure that she gets elected the next president of the United States.
Just lastly, we hear from Donald Trump and Republicans that Kamala Harris, you're the mayor of San Francisco, is just another San Francisco liberal. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would respond, I mean, the Republicans continue to point to San Francisco, but at the end of the day, oftentimes they are picking up their iPhone, you know, which was introduced in San Francisco, calling their Ubers or Lyft, companies started and based in San Francisco, to go to their Airbnb company still and started in San Francisco, and then to go and tweet something nasty about our city, which again was a company until recently in San Francisco. $34 billion of venture capitalist investment last year alone, the AI capital of the world. That's what I will say. You can continue to try and put out a narrative, but the facts tell a different story. And we point to the facts and the economy and everything that San Francisco stands for on the world stage. Everything that everyone is using as far as technology, it starts right in San Francisco. And again, we're looking forward to making sure Kamala Harris gets elected, because then San Francisco will be on a whole nother national stage.
All right, San Francisco Mayor London Breed, great to have you here with us in Chicago. Maybe we'll see you in San Francisco sometime. We appreciate your time, Mayor. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, of course, as we're here in Chicago focusing on politics, we also have to keep check on the financial markets, especially as it's Jackson Hole Week in addition to Convention Week. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle has a look for us. Hey, Abigail.
Hey, Kaylee. Well, it may be that Jackson Hole wait-and-see period that has stocks basically treading water. We have the S&P 500 flipping between very small gains and losses. The Dow had been down moments ago. It's now slightly higher. The NASDAQ 100 also up just about 0.2%. Now, that said, for the S&P 500, even though today is a very low volume day, volume 30% below already anemic recent volume, it is the 10th up day out of the last 12 days. So we've had this big upswing after a downswing just a few weeks ago. And you know, one of the factors, of course, is that Jackson Hole, but there's so many uncertainty factors around the Fed at Jackson Hole. Folks will want to hear about the commitment to cutting rates. Right now, 3 to 4 cuts are priced in for this year, depending on what source you look at. And because of that uncertainty, also the uncertainty of the yen carry trade unwind that we've been talking about, we have the VIX elevated. Now, what makes this interesting is we have the S&P 500 higher, and yet this VIX is higher for a second day day in a row. Typically, this uncertainty index, some would even call it the fear index, it only goes higher if stocks are down. So this tells you some folks are just hedging a little bit. They're a little bit nervous about what they might hear out of Jackson Hole. But of course, it's not just Jackson Hole. It is also that yen. Yesterday, it had been higher, the actual yen, dollar yen down for a third day in a row, pointing to the idea that some of that cheap money was coming out, and that could really create a problem for risk assets. We're seeing that pause on the day. But the other piece of uncertainty, naturally, all of you know about it more than me, has to do, of course, with the DNC and election 2024 more so. If we take a look at the burgeoning Harris trade, which would be home builders that cater to early home first-time buyers, such as D.R. Horton, that stock's at a record high, up 3.4%. So some investors may be giving a nod of approval to the idea that there could be some sort of relief given for down payments. On the other hand, that other idea of capping grocery prices, well, Kroger's up 1.5% today. That would suggest some folks think that that's not going to happen. And then also interesting, this is not the Harris trade, it's the Trump trade, although I guess you could say it's the inverse of the Harris trade. We do have DJT up 11% today, the best day in more than a month. It's not entirely clear what's behind this, but one thing we do know is this stock had been down so much. A little bit of this could be a rebound. Something we'll be taking a look at, though, in the next hour, Joe, is the predicted odds. Interestingly, the betting odds are narrowing a little bit between Kamala Harris, VP Harris, and Donald Trump, but VP Harris still on top.
Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle keeping us honest on the markets. Thank you so much, Abigail, for being part of our coverage. Live from Chicago as we assembled our panel. Now on day 3 of the Democratic National Convention alongside Kayleigh Lines. Rick Davis is here, partner at Stonecourt Capital, Republican strategist. And Jeanne Zaino, Iona University political science professor, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Our signature panel back together, day 3. Want to see how everybody's feeling. It was a big night in the room with the Obamas talking. How do you top that? How'd you like to be Tim Walz now?
I have to tell you, I think it might have been the best one night, Rick, except for your convention, of a convention I have ever seen. The Democrats knocked it out of the park. You know, when you can make a roll call exciting and have Little John and DJ Cassidy, and I mean, I heard from people who said, I don't care about this convention, but boy, was that fun. From that to go into Michelle Obama's speech, which, again, may be one of the best speeches we've heard at a convention, and then poor Barack Obama having to follow her, but he married her, so that's his problem. It was a fabulous night. My concern is, what do they do the next 2 nights? It was an amazing night.
Well, yeah, certainly it's a tough act to follow if you are the vice presidential nominee and Governor Tim Walz, who is the headliner tonight. Just quickly, though, on the Obamas, Rick, I wonder if the reason it may have been so powerful in that room, if you can say that, is that we don't hear from him that frequently. We haven't over the last 2 years. And I wonder if it's actually scarcity that is the best way to use Obama, using him sporadically throughout this campaign, or does he need to be on the trail as much as he can for Harris in these final 3 months?
Well, I think 2 of those things go together, right? One of the reasons he is so popular today and effective is the scarcity, right? He hasn't sort of become commonplace. And now's the time to make him commonplace, right? So, you know, use that elevated popularity to hit the campaign trail. And honestly, if they just carved out a couple of blue wall states and said, you know, Barack Obama, you go here, Michelle Obama, you go there, I think that's a very powerful concept, you know, as to how to use that family. I just want some of whatever Jeannie's drinking. I mean, like, she's got so much energy on the 3rd day of this convention. But she's right. You feed off of it at a convention. That's what gets you going. And I think this convention has an enormous amount of energy around it.
He didn't get on until after 11 o'clock, though.
11:02.
Is this still a problem, keeping the run of show together? Because we've got the big nights now. This is obviously the nominee, the running mate. You can't show up after prime time on the East Coast, can you?
Yeah. No, I mean, like, it's a dilemma that the Democrats have, and it was added dilemma yesterday because they had this sort of remote convention happening in Milwaukee with the nominee, and you can't shortchange her. And the ticket out there. And so, I don't know. I mean, maybe they're just trying to do too much, right? I mean, sure, you've got a action-packed group last night. You wanted to maximize it, but you want to maximize it in prime time. You want to own that prime time. And the minute you start getting late in the East Coast, you're losing eyeballs. And Granted, maybe people stay up to see Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. It's a great act to follow. But tonight, I think it's really going to be incumbent upon this convention to hit its marks, because America needs to get to know the vice presidential nominee, Walz. And the only way they're going to get is this one speech.
Well, so high stakes then, if Rick is to be believed, that this is the moment for Tim Walz. It maybe makes it make or break. What message does he need to bring? Does he bring the idea that here I am as my own man and this is what I believe, or this is what I will do to support the beliefs of Kamala Harris? What is the role of the running mate this evening?
He is going to be Coach Walz. That is what Kamala Harris has been calling him. You know, forget anything else, governor, anything else. He is Coach Walz, and that is who I think we're going to hear from tonight. I will give the DNC this. I stood here yesterday, and questioned, you know, what are they doing 2 nights? They filled 2 of these convention halls, 20,000 in one, 15,000 in another. The timing was impeccable. You went from California right to Kamala Harris. It was really well done. And so I think tonight they have a hard act to follow. But Coach Walz, I think, he's not only coach, he is cheerleader. I mean, you watch him out there. His hands are flailing. He is all about Kamala Harris. I think we're going to see that tonight. You know, everybody keeps saying he is the coach from Friday Night Lights. If he can capture that, he doesn't look like him necessarily, but he acts like him. If he can capture that, it's going to be great. But boy, was last night a hard act to follow. And I love, Kaylee, that you were saying 11:02, not 11.
That's correct.
Not that we were counting.
Late, I think. I think a lot of people agree that you had one of the most successful vice presidential nominating speeches in the history of conventions. And with Sarah Palin, you had the element of surprise. I know things got complicated after that, Rick, but the less that is known about the candidate creates opportunity. Is that the case for Tim Walz?
This is exactly the case for Governor Walz. And he has a high bar, right? I mean, this is his moment to introduce himself. But he has a multiplicity of things he's got to do. Not only does he have to introduce himself, whether it's coach or governor or former congressman or, you know, staff sergeant or whatever his proper insignia was, he's got to tell his biography. He's got to fill in all these blank spots. He's got to attack Donald Trump. I mean, one of the things that I was surprised last night is Trump didn't have that bad a night last night at the Democratic convention. I mean, you know, there were some cutting remarks and some nice phrases that were used, but at the end of the day, nobody really took down Donald Trump. And so this is the job of the vice president. He's got to add that to his element. And then he's got to, like, say some really nice things about the nominee, because she, too, is introducing herself to the country in many ways. And so he's got to fill in some of that narrative. So I think it's actually even a bigger obstacle than Sarah Palin had, because all she really needed to do was talk about herself. And he's got a lot more jobs to do tonight than she did.
We did see some hits at Trump from Barack Obama, talking about what he called his weird obsession with crowd size. He called him stale at one point, suggested he's been whining for years. And we heard Michelle Obama take swings at Trump, too. What we heard from Barack Obama, though, that we didn't hear from the former First Lady was kind words about Joe Biden. Jeanne, and I wonder if last night was actually also revealing about the nature of the Biden family, Obama family relationship, now that we understand Obama did have a hand in pushing Biden out of this race.
You know, I know there's been a lot made of the fact that you know, former First Lady Michelle Obama didn't talk about Joe Biden or the First Lady. You know, from my perspective, we sat up here saying yesterday, as so many people did today, yesterday actually, day too, couldn't be about Joe Biden. It had to be about Kamala Harris. And I think that Michelle Obama hit that out of the park. She did take on Donald Trump, but she did it beautifully without using his name, which I think is the way to take him on. So, you know, I know a lot has been made of that tension, and I'm sure there are some hard feelings there. But on the other hand, this is about looking forward, and that's what the Obamas were able to do last night. And again, Michelle Obama, you know, she has the benefit of not being in politics, which makes it harder to be liked. But I heard one of my conservative friends say, thank God that woman never ran for office, because that would be the death knell of the Republican Party. I'm not sure it's that bad, Rick.
The
Don't
entire
get worried.
party.
But she is that good. So, you know, I think she did what she had to do, even though she didn't mention Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, betting markets still had odds on her becoming the Democratic nominee for a while there.
Yes, indeed.
And we definitely were paying attention, as were Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, our signature political panel. Plenty more to come with these guys throughout the next hour here on Bloomberg TV and radio. But of course, there's other things that betting markets are focused on too, not just the outcome of the election, but also what the Federal Reserve is going to be doing over the course of the next several months. And a lot of that will depend on the trajectory for the economy. This is something we spoke about with a White House official from the National Economic Council of Advisors, Heather Boushey, yesterday.
We've actually seen wages now rising for 17 months for production and non-supervisory workers, the 80% of the workforce that are not managers or not professionals in the economy. So they are going to, whoever the president will inherit an economy that is really at that cruising altitude. You know, we keep talking about a soft landing, but this economy just keeps humming along and has been quite robust. At the same time, one of the really important things will be that because of the president's Invest in America agenda, we've seen investments all across the economy that are starting to take fruit. We've seen historic amounts of investment in the construction of new manufacturing facilities all across the country. That's been going on for 6 quarters now at a historic level. And that is taking shape in communities all across the country. I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of communities over the past year and a half, and seeing where jobs are being created and what those economies look like. That kind of, bringing communities along, that is what this next president, the kind of economy that they're going to inherit.
And as we think about the economy and how the feelings around it are affecting different demographic groups in the U.S. ahead of this election, joining us now here on set in Chicago is Joe Nguyen. He is Washington State Senator and CEO of the AAPI Victory Fund, a national political action committee focused on increasing Asian American and Pacific Islander representation in elected offices. Thank you so much for joining us, Joe. It's great to have you. We've had a lot of conversation about the way in which, when it was still Biden who was the candidate, Latino voters, Black voters were starting to turn away from him or away from the Democratic Party. We've heard a lot about those groups coming back. What are you seeing in the AAPI community?
Well, and I agree. We love Joe Biden. We think he's a fantastic president. But if you look at the 2020 elections to 2024, you saw a drift within the AA and HPI community. There was about a 14% drop in support from Democrats away from that, whether they drifted out or to Republicans, to be seen. But now the energy is tremendous. It's electric in terms of what we're seeing right now. I'm seeing elders in our communities who've never been politically involved before now active for Kamala Harris. And then that's what we're seeing today.
Why, the why is what we want to hear about. Is it more hope for the economy? Is it to be represented by someone who you have more in common with? What is the community saying?
All of the above. First off, the Asian community represents about 6% of the voting population in swing states, so about 1.6 million. So in every swing state, the Asian population is bigger than the margin of victory. When you see somebody who reflects your values, when you see somebody who has your experiences, somebody who was working class growing up, worked multiple jobs, immigrant family, it resonates with us. Because oftentimes when you're in public office, it isn't so much your policies, it's how you make some people feel. So they know that this is an auntie. This is somebody who will protect your communities. This is somebody that has a history of fighting for our communities, and we know she'll keep that.
So it's her story more than her policies.
It's her story, it's her policies, it's her history, it's her experience. It's the fact that her mom had Tupperware that she used from recycled old goods that we did as well. It's the recipes that she has at home. Everything about it represents our values.
Well, as you bring up recipes, Kamala Harris in a kitchen with other people of Indian descent or wearing saris, for example, are images that we've seen circulated by Donald Trump in recent weeks as he suggests that she's flip-flopping her heritage or racial identity, that she was at first Indian American and now she's saying that she's Black. Is she Indian or she's Black? Is the question he's been asking. How does that sit with you and the people in your community you speak with?
One of my favorite congresswomen is Marilyn Strickland from Washington State, who is also half Black and half Asian. I have a number of friends who are mixed race. My family is mixed race as well. So that is something that we've seen our entire lives. And that type of bullying is exactly what we faced growing up. So seeing that happen is not at all a surprise. It actually mobilizes us even more and galvanizes our support in her existence and her experiences because it reflects ours.
You were endorsed early on by Pramila Jayapal when you were running for Senate.
That's right.
which I'm sure was a big deal for your career. And she represents a certain movement in Washington and represented a cadre of House members, progressive House members, who were not happy, and in many cases still are not, when it comes to the administration's policy surrounding Israel. How does Kamala Harris change the view?
You know, what's interesting is the AAPI Victory Fund, we visited Michigan before the switch, about 1 week before, and we did what was called the Uncommitted Listening Tour. And it was just, we wanted to come, say hello, introduce ourselves, talk to folks on the grounds. And there was a lot of frustration around what was happening, obviously. I think that switch was an acknowledgement of the anxiety that they were feeling. The fact that that happened, I think, is a testament to some of the advocacy that they have as well. Obviously, there's still some reserve in terms of what that actually looks like in practice. Pramila Jayapal is here with us this week, obviously. She supports the vice president, supports this ticket. You know, I think that you can be multiple things at one time. We love this country, we love this administration, and that gives us the right to criticize it as well when they're not doing the things that we want. So the fact that we come from an organizing perspective that allows us to have these conversations in earnest is much better than the alternative.
And I want to ask you finally about one other issue, given that your role in the state Senate, you also are specifically on the Energy and Technology and Environment
That's right.
How do you expect climate change issues to feature in this election when Joe Biden is very frequently heralding his climate accomplishments in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act? What do you expect a President Harris would do?
Well, first off, she would build upon that legacy. The IRA was one of the most transformative pieces of policies that we've ever seen since FDR. The investments that we're seeing, even in Washington state and nationally, are going to put us on the map when it comes to climate policies going forward. Climate change is more than just worrying about decarbonization and the existential threat. It's transmission lines, it's infrastructure, it's investments. People, even if they don't care about climate change, are going to see jobs because of it, and they will care about their pocketbooks, and they will care about the economy. So the continuation of Kamala Harris's plans around climate change will be transformative for us.
Glad you could come see us while we're in Chicago. Enjoy the rest of your convention. Joe Nguyen, AAPI Victory Fund CEO, with us here speaking on behalf of his movement and the Harris campaign. And we're going to have a lot more ahead in the next hour of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is day 3 of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And as we work our way through the day, alongside Kayleigh Lyons, we'll be joined by Florida Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, Pat Dennis of American Bridge 21st Century, and of course our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, are with us for the balance of the week here in Chicago. It's the second to last night. Tim Walz will be in prime time later on, and we'll have much more ahead on what to look for. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kayleigh Lyons, and it is day 3. Tonight is the night that we will hear on the stage from the vice presidential nominee as he formally accepts that role. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is the headliner tonight, a night in which, Joe, we will also be hearing from former President Bill Clinton, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, and the current House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries. And that is just the start of the list.
Yeah, they've got another big night lined up here. And of course, it follows a big night with the Obamas, former President, former First Lady Michelle Obama, captivating a crowd in a series of speeches that did run late again. Kayleigh, due to be noted, but certainly landed well in the room. We've been talking with Democrats throughout the day here in Chicago who are clearly motivated by what they saw and heard last night.
Yeah, and of course, you will be there on the floor tonight as Tim Walz speaks to see the energy in person yourself. It's also worth pointing out, Joe is doing all of this work for us here in Chicago on his birthday. So happy birthday, Joe. Happy night 3 of the convention.
Thank you, indeed. We're going to spend some time with the coach later on when he speaks. But to Kayleigh's point, there's going to be a much larger list of speakers here. And that's where we start our conversation with Bloomberg's Stephanie Lai, who's been living on the campaign trail for months, finding us here in Chicago now. Nice to bump into you again in the middle of America. That was a big night for the DNC. How do they continue the energy tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Obamas set a pretty high bar. It was almost as if the energy and the message of hope that President Obama had in his 2008 campaign was brought back. at this convention today, and that's what we're hearing from delegates across all the states right now. You know, I think what we're looking for is these speakers to come up on tonight and tomorrow to really just highlight Harris's message and to get that point across that they're not just taking for granted that they have 70-something days left of this campaign, and that people really have to go out and make the difference on a grassroots level.
Something else that was remarkable about last night wasn't just the speeches from the Obamas or even from the second gentleman. It was the fact that Kamala Harris herself wasn't there. She wasn't even in Chicago. She was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, instead at the Pfizer Forum where the RNC was held last month, filling it with thousands of people, knowing that Donald Trump has an issue with this crowd size competition, if you will. How did that play, not just for the Harris-Walz campaign, but do you have any reaction from the Trump-Vance campaign?
I haven't seen any reaction just yet, but it is notable that she managed to fill two massive arenas with supporters. That's just, you know, almost unheard of. And so the energy that we're seeing from her campaign is still moving forward. And, you know, we know that they're going to keep barnstorming all of these battleground states. So I guess time will tell.
Meanwhile, we look to Asheboro, North Carolina to find the other campaign. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance holding a rally there later. They've been very deliberate about counter-programming this convention every day this week.
Every single day. They have allies here in Chicago that are talking to members of the press. President Trump has been doing many more interviews with journalists, putting his name out there, getting his face in front of voters. And every single day has had a specific theme. So, you know, he's spoken about economy, about safety and crime, and we're expecting him to go to the border on Thursday to talk about immigration. These are all talking points that his campaign has made a very big push for, and they believe that those are the vulnerabilities that Vice President Harris has moving into November.
I wonder as well, knowing that they had already made the decision to go to the swing states, how the nature of the message may be different in North Carolina, given the way in which we have seen polling there change from the New York Times Siena poll this past weekend that showed Harris actually leading Trump in North Carolina to yesterday, Sabato's crystal ball, switching it from lean Republican to a toss-up. Is this a state we should expect that they're going to be paying more attention to than maybe they would have, say, 4 weeks ago?
Well, I mean, we've already seen him go into North Carolina a couple times since Harris has entered the race, and we're also noticing that they're putting more money into these states. What's particularly interesting is that this is the state that the RNC chairman Michael Whatley and the co-chair Laura Trump hail from, and so they're really going on an offensive right now because it seemed like North Carolina was just going to be an easy win, but it really does seem like there's been some shift and that it might be a state that they have to defend.
Bring us behind the scenes a bit at this convention, because people see the speeches in prime time, but there's a lot more going on around here. And a reporter like yourself is pretty busy shuttling around to different events, news conferences, fundraisers. Tell us about what isn't happening on the stage that a lot of people don't get a chance to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion among delegates. We're seeing a lot of electeds going to these events. I was actually in Chinatown yesterday with the AAPI Victory Fund, where a lot of our AAPI elected officials were speaking to the folks that are here and to try to energize the base and make clear that, you know, Democrats are really interested in reaching people of color, and they're not taking these votes for granted. And so I think what we're seeing behind the scenes is just a lot of energy and trying to get the delegates to be excited for what's to come.
I think something we thought, or at least we're bracing ourselves to see, thought we'd see more of, is protests over the ongoing war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. Certainly there has been some. There have been some altercations with the police, though nothing has gotten incredibly violent. But are the people you've been talking with surprised that it hasn't been more of a force here in Chicago?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point. I mean, they did breach the barricade. I think that was yesterday, right? But their presence hasn't been as noticeable. And perhaps it's because this is such a large city. These events are taking place across the town. So, you know, we're shuttling from one stop and then taking the metro for another 3 miles. So it's really hard to have that presence when, you know, all these events are not consolidated in one spot.
Yeah, you just wonder, though, if maybe not as many people showed up because of the change at the top of the ticket, or if there was a little bit of bluster here. I mean, that wouldn't be unusual. Predictions of tens of thousands of protesters simply haven't come true, have they?
No, I don't think so. I haven't been keeping close tabs, though. But I mean, I've seen a couple of protests here and there, but they do seem very isolated. Maybe a couple hundred people tops. The first night that I was here on Sunday, there was a couple folks walking down Michigan Avenue. But as far as I can tell, I haven't really seen a huge presence.
Yeah, I did have great difficulty getting through traffic.
There were
when I arrived
100
on
people
Sunday
coming down
night.
Michigan
Yes.
Avenue that night. That's
Yeah.
right. That's one of the largest collections that we've seen so far.
And it was more the street closures and the barricades
right.
around that just made navigation a little bit more difficult than it otherwise would have been. Stephanie Lai navigating this entire city of Chicago for us. Thank you so much
Stephanie.
for joining us in what is a very busy week. And of course, a week, as we mentioned, in which we saw, which is a rare occurrence these days, former President Barack Obama on the stage, as well as the former First Lady, his wife, Michelle Obama, who had a message for voters about the need to turn out in November.
Yes, Kamala and Tim are doing great now. We're loving it. They're packing arenas across the country. Folks are energized. We are feeling good. But remember, there are still so many people who are desperate for a different outcome, who are ready to question and criticize every move Kamala makes, who are eager to spread those lies, who don't want to vote for a woman, who will continue to prioritize building their wealth over ensuring that everyone has enough. So no matter how good we feel tonight or tomorrow or the next day, this is going to be an uphill battle. So folks, we cannot be our own worst enemies. No. See, because the minute something goes wrong, the minute a lie takes hold, folks, we cannot start wringing our hands. We cannot get a Goldilocks complex about whether everything is just right. And we cannot indulge our anxieties about whether this country will elect someone like Kamala instead of doing everything we can to get someone like Kamala elected.
And of course, for someone like Kamala or anyone to be elected, you have to win the Electoral College. You got to get those 270 Electoral College votes. And the map, as we understand it, includes, Joe, about 7 swing states. But there have been conversations, at least when Biden was still in the race, as to whether or not a state like Virginia could be up for grabs for a Republican. And even still, there does seem to be a suggestion that maybe even a state like Florida could be one up for grab for the Democrats.
Depends who you ask.
Yeah.
Like our next guest.
Indeed. And on that note, we go now to a congresswoman from Florida. Democrat Debbie Wasserman-Schultz is here with us on set in Chicago. Great to see you.
Great to see you both.
Congresswoman, if we could just begin, knowing that you just had a decisive victory in your primary in Florida last night as well. What are you seeing on the ground in Florida? Do you think it would be wise for the Harris campaign to be investing resources in the state, knowing the many, many media markets it has? It's a very expensive state to be competitive in. But if she made the decision to, could she actually be competitive?
I'm telling everybody, as are most political folks in Florida, don't sleep on our state. We have some metrics that are emerging. Remember, for most election cycles in this century, we have been a purple state. We've been hyper-competitive. Barack Obama won Florida both times that he ran. And I'll give you an example from just yesterday's primary. The enthusiasm among Democratic voters is off the charts. I mean, just to give you an idea, I won my primary, but it's not the win. It's the difference in the voter turnout between Democrats and Republicans. 34,000 people voted in, I got 34,000 votes. The primary winner on the Republican side got 13,000 votes. So just in terms of enthusiasm, you can see the difference. But polling last week, both national polls that came out that polled Florida had the race within 3 and 5. And then if you look at the volunteer organization on the ground, 22,000 people signed up to volunteer to elect Kamala Harris President of the United States. So with the resources, and also the Republicans have continued to distort their advantage. They say they have 1 million more registered voters in Florida. They don't. What they did was that they suppressed the voters who haven't voted in 2 elections and now show them as inactive, even though they're still registered. So there aren't 1 million more Republicans registered to vote. We have huge enthusiasm. We beat almost every Moms for Liberty candidate that Ron DeSantis endorsed for school board races last night, about almost 24 that he endorsed, and he only won 6 of them. So the momentum is in our direction. No one should sleep on Florida.
Well, interesting. And looking more broadly, Florida and across the country, and not just the swing states, Congresswoman, our listeners and viewers should be reminded that you were chair of the DNC during Barack Obama's second convention.
Yes.
As President of the United States, will you seek to duplicate his map?
Well, what we're seeking to do is make sure that we can capitalize on the enthusiasm and the contrast between the momentum that we have under Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, because hope and optimism, like we had during the Obama years, and joy is what is pushing people forward, because they want a president who is going to fight for them to reduce prescription drug prices.
But you are talking about more states than you were when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket.
There is no question right now that we have different math in multiple different directions than we had just five or 6 weeks ago. And so what we can't do is just, move forward without pivoting and making the kind of adjustments that we need to and being nimble. And that's what our campaign operations are doing right now. And they're doing some recalculations so they can be ready for any opportunity.
Well, and I wonder how those recalculations are factoring into the likelihood of not just getting the majority in the House, but how large you think your majority could potentially be with Harris at the top of the ticket. You obviously are a member of House leadership. Has the goalposts moved? Initially, it was like, you just got to get those 4 seats. But what's the target now?
Well, we have to net 4 seats, and we have a very clear advantage in the fundraising. We have consistently outraised the NRCC, the Republican campaign finance operation, every single quarter of this election cycle. But it's not just that. Our incumbent frontline marginal members, they've outraised their opposition. Our red to blue candidates, they have a recruitment problem. They've got right-wing extremists all over the map. So the contrast is clear all the way down the ticket, from the White House pair of candidates down to legislative races. And voters are going to come out to the polls, elect our candidates, because they want someone who's thinking about moving forward, not a MAGA extremist Republican who's buried in the past, who's morose and brooding and unhappy. We've got to make sure that we have a positive, forward-thinking government so that we can ensure that this booming economy, 15 million plus jobs, making sure that we continue to bring prescription drug prices down, that we make sure that we have a plan like Kamala Harris does to make home ownership affordable and child tax credit reinstated. So many things that are important on the kitchen table, not a president like Donald Trump was, who cared only about making sure that the wealthy and the profitable businesses are able to do even better.
I want to ask you about an issue I know is very important to you and a lot of progressive Democrats, and that's our policy in Israel right now. It's the reason why we've been talking about protesters that in some cases have not materialized here in Chicago. Congresswoman, there are reports today that U.S. and Israeli officials think that this proposal for a bridge ceasefire deal is on the verge of collapsing. We heard from Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Doha. Here's what he said.
Our message is simple, it's clear, and it's urgent. We need to get the ceasefire and hostage agreement over the finish line, and we need to do it now. Time is of the essence.
How important will it be for a ceasefire to be struck to find unity among progressives in the Democratic Party?
What's important is that Hamas release the hostages. What's important is that Israel not be expected, like any other nation shouldn't be expected, to live with a terrorist threat sworn on their destruction and the killing of all Jews on their doorstep. What's important is making sure that the terror threat that Palestinians in Gaza live with is ended, so that they can free Gaza from Hamas. And that, when we reach a ceasefire deal that releases those hostages, that ensures that we can have governance in Gaza that is peaceful and non-threatening, that is absolutely essential. The time that's running out is that we have 109 hostages still there, at least 8 that are American, that need to be freed. I mean, we have to make sure, and thanks to the Biden-Harris administration for staying at the table, pushing the negotiations forward, but Hamas needs to take this deal. That is the bottom line.
Well, and we'll wait to see if they do so and on what time frame, knowing that they also could be considering that it will be a different government come January if they drag this out long enough. You just mentioned what the Biden-Harris administration has done. Do you expect that there would be a serious departure from this administration's policy if it were instead a Harris-Walz administration. How does she
Not at
differ
all.
from the incumbent president?
She doesn't differ. She's made very clear that she is right alongside President Biden. She's been a part of those discussions, the negotiations. Kamala Harris supports making sure that we have a ceasefire deal that brings the hostages home, that ends the terrorist threat on Israel's doorstep, that ensures that we can get humanitarian assistance and relief to the Palestinians who are victimized by Hamas themselves, and also continuing the strong U.S. aid to Israel. She said very clearly she's not for an arms embargo. We have the strongest plank in the Democratic Party platform, strongest pro-Israel plank of any party in decades. And the Republicans come nowhere near the commitments and the specificity in the Democratic Party platform that we have, and that's because the Democratic Party is the one that has solidly and consistently stood with Israel, not just in words, but in actions.
What happens to Gaza if Donald Trump is elected?
You know, when it comes to how foreign policy is dealt with in general, I'm very fearful about what happens because Donald Trump doesn't actually care about how to make sure that Gaza is governed in the aftermath and how you end the terrorist threat and ensure that the security apparatus that needs to be in place for Israel is put in place in a way that allows a peaceful transition and the negotiation over an Arab-forward governing coalition. He reacts only emotionally and not with thought or commitment. And I'm very fearful because of Project 2025 of who he's going to put in place in these important State Department positions to ensure that we have real professionals who are able to do things like Joe Biden has, getting these negotiations together and making sure that we have a diplomatic apparatus that has the experience and the commitment they need.
Thanks for coming to see us.
Thank you so much.
Good luck the rest of this convention.
Thank
you. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman-Schultz of Florida, former chair of the DNC. We're live in Chicago on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are live from Chicago, the city hosting the Democratic National Convention, which, of course, is getting ready for its third night. We'll see, Joe, if things run a little bit more on schedule this evening, as twice in a row, the headliners, first President Biden, then former President Barack Obama, ran a little past prime time.
That's true.
On the East Coast.
We have the benefit, at least, of being an hour earlier here. It was past 11 p.m. when Barack Obama finally got on the stage, remembering Joe Biden's midnight appointment on Monday. It's going to be more important, I think, for convention organizers to make sure the running mate gets on a friendlier hour.
Yeah, because this is the first time for many in the country that they will be hearing directly from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. She wasn't necessarily a well-known figure in Democratic politics until Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee, and he coined the phrase weird in describing Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
Here we are tonight. I think we'll hear that word. With us now, our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, Republican strategist alongside Jeanne, Zaino, Iona University, political science professor, senior fellow, democracy with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to see you both. Axios reporting that Tim Walz has never used a teleprompter before. Rick, the stakes here, and not just the speech itself, but the logistics around it. How do you prepare a candidate for a moment like that?
Well, certainly in this case, if he's never used a teleprompter, you get him a lot of work on a teleprompter because, of course, using a teleprompter at press conference is one thing. Using it in front of 50,000 people and in a big night like this, they're tricky to use. And so I think getting him comfortable with that, and comfort matters, is probably one of their number one situations. Two, getting him comfortable with the speech. Remember, these people haven't been the nominees very long. I mean, he just emerged 10 days ago. And so the reality for him is he's had to get comfortable quickly with probably the most important speech he'll ever give in his entire life. And so at this stage, he's probably sequestered with his aides, running through the speech over and over and again, doing some tweaking. But now it's also controlling your nerves because this is a nervous moment when you walk out and that crowd goes crazy. And you can get really emotional if you don't have control of your senses.
Amazing.
Yeah, a bit higher stakes than, you know, a locker room pep talk for the team or something like that for Coach Walz, Jeanne, as we've often heard him described. But on that note, they have leaned into this image of he was a football coach and a teacher. He's America's dad. He's a, you know, everyday guy. Don't people also need to see on that stage, though, someone who could assume the office of the presidency if something were to happen to Kamala Harris? Is there such a thing as too much of the nice guy thing?
Never too much nice guy. No, I do think, because most Americans, to your point, 3 weeks ago, outside of his own home state, had never heard of him, didn't know who he was. So he is going to have to introduce himself. My one concern about the timing is, don't we know that Bill Clinton has a part of this tonight? Yes. And who goes longer than Bill Clinton?
In conclusion,
going to have to pull him in. If he hasn't used a teleprompter and spoken at a convention, gosh, my advice would be, speed it up, folks. I say this in deference to my students. They think we all talk very slow because they listen to everything on top speed except for you guys. And so speed up the speech and ride the applause. You're speaking to people at home, not people in the room. So that is, he didn't ask for my advice. That would be my advice. I do think we're going to hear a lot about the coach. I do think we're going to hear a lot about his partner, Kamala Harris. I think we're going to hear less about policy. But I do think he has to make the case to the American people. God forbid something happens to Kamala Harris if they're elected. He is ready to assume that office. So, people keep telling me Kyle Chandler. I don't know who's going to introduce him, but that is the coach from Friday Night Lights. That's who he's going after, Kaylee. So
you're just mapping all this out. I love this.
Listen, I got a lot of time here in Chicago, Joe.
Well, okay, is he going to address the elephant in the room here, the questions of stolen valor and his military experience, or does he just fly over it?
He might fly high, right, as you say. He has something to say about that. Obviously, he's proud of his service career, and he's made it clear he doesn't think that should be part of a campaign. And he's actually complimented J.D. Vance's career in the military. So I would actually think that he would use that device of making the point that we honor everybody's service, no matter how or why they do it. And so that's a great shout out to every veteran in America. And that's how the line of attack should be. It should not be me versus you. It should be we're all in this together.
Well, we've heard not a lot of attack lines from Democrats here in Chicago, more so just lines of praise for both Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, including from the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Vilsack. Tom Vilsack joined Bloomberg earlier today in his personal capacity, but he had this to say about Governor Walz.
Governor Walz is someone that you can put into any room in any community in any part of the country, and he would be able to relate to the people in that room, which means that he can be a very powerful spokesperson for rural America, for the small towns and rural places in the country that oftentimes don't get the level of attention that they deserve. He understands that. I think that's why he's been successful.
So on this idea of rural America, as we consider the kinds of populations and demographics they're trying to draw out and make sure vote for them in November, what is the message that rural America needs to hear, not just from Tim Walz, but from Kamala Harris herself?
I think they need to hear that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz understand the challenges that they are facing. And I couldn't agree more with Tom Vilsack. As important as I thought last night was, and as good of a job as the DNC had a good night, the one criticism I had was the voters they need are these folks that he is talking about. And they are going to have to appeal to them with this message that Kamala Harris, we've heard her use, which is economic opportunity, sort of borrowing from an old-style GOP, where we are going to have opportunity for freedom, liberty, and success if you take it. So I think understanding their challenges and letting them know that they and their children and their grandchildren have a bright future ahead of them. And this is how, we won't get into the specifics, but those are the kind of messages that they're going to need to hear. And quite frankly, that's a danger the DNC runs here, is that if they are appealing to other folks on the coasts and not these people in the middle.
Well, so it's a battle for rural between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance. How does Tim Walz win that argument without becoming too folksy and too cute in an address?
No, I don't think he does win that argument. I think there's been a realignment. Donald Trump won 256 counties that Barack Obama won twice, and Joe Biden in 2020 only won a dozen of those back. Those are gone. Those are Republicans now. They're going to vote Republican. It's a much better use of the Democrats' time if you boil it down. to run up the numbers in suburbs and urban areas to offset the losses they're going to take in those counties. Look, they're not talking about the economy. That's what these people care about. They haven't benefited from the increased economy in the Biden administration, and they say so loudly in every focus group and every poll that we take. Donald Trump continues to outpace both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris when it comes to who's best able to manage the economy. So I think they've got to go where they can find votes, and it's not going to be in the rural communities.
Just on the idea that those people are now Republicans, are they Republicans or are they populists? Because isn't that the common thread that you could pull between those who would vote for Obama in 2008 and 2012 and who shifted to vote for Donald Trump?
Well, there's a third group, and I'd call them MAGAs.
Okay, sure.
And so that's some combination of those two things, right? And yet they're signed up. I mean, that's what you saw on the floor of the convention in Milwaukee for Donald Trump. These are the people who fuel the MAGA. And everyone said, oh, where are the votes coming from? Well, former Democrats, you know, who used to be working class whites in rural areas without college education are now the base of the Republican Party.
And this is why we saw the roll call that we saw last night, right? If you're trying to get young people in the suburbs and in urban areas, you put a show like that together. We would not have seen that in Milwaukee.
We would not have. And, you know, it was like the Super Bowl of politics. I heard from so many people, again, who said, we don't watch this stuff, but that was fun. And so, but I do agree with Rick that, you know, they may have lost those rural areas already, but they can't bleed them anymore. When you're talking about states like Wisconsin and Michigan, and they're going to be so tight, and that was one thing we heard from Michelle Obama yesterday, they've got to fight for those and watch for this notion of economic opportunity, economy from Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, because that is the message they are trying to send. It's not going to be a winning message in those areas necessarily, but they want to stop bleeding there as they have been. Democrats have been for some time now.
Well, as we allude to this roll call, we should actually give our listeners and viewers a taste of what it was like in the United Center last night.
The proud great state of Alabama proudly cast 56 votes for the first Black woman president of the United States of America.
Colorado proudly cast its votes for Kamala Harris. Get it go! Indiana delivers its 86 delegates.
Minnesota, we cast 10 votes present, and we deliver 81 votes for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz.
California, we proudly cast our 482 votes for the next president, Kamala Harris. Yeah! Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight to officially nominate Kamala Harris for president. Five, get loud, another round of shots. DNC, turn out for what?
That has been perpetually in my head on repeat since last night. I mean, that kind of energy, Rick, are Republicans now looking back on their convention in Milwaukee thinking, dang.
Oh, I don't think we could have pulled that off. You know, in conventions, you manage these things and you say, oh, this roll call is such a pain. You hate going through it. Nobody's interested. Nobody watches it. I cannot tell you how many phone calls and texts I've gotten today about why didn't we ever think of doing something fun like that in our roll call? It was a blast. Highlight of the convention as far as I'm concerned.
Wow, that's something. I mean, you had Kid Rock, right? I guess that would be the equivalent in Milwaukee.
But Lil Jon.
Lil Jon, though. So he actually rebuffed and asked for an endorsement by Donald Trump. You had to call him to come to Chicago.
You had to call him. He was on Celebrity Apprentice, and come on, you know, that is the kind of thing that you can just imagine has frustrated Donald Trump.
Was that the end of this whole narrative that young black men are drifting toward Donald Trump? Is that now something in the past?
I don't think so. I don't think it's the end. I don't think you're going to do as well as he wanted. But I do think Republicans have a argument there when it comes to the economy, but they've just got to talk about it. But Donald Trump wants to talk about other things like Taylor Swift and AI. So, you know, it's hard to keep him on track. But Lil Jon last night, that was a coup. And the DJ Wayne, is that it? He was amazing.
DJ Cassidy, you're referring to, yes. And I did have to look, Kaylee.
Okay, well, there you go. As I think about finally what we're hearing from Donald Trump, he's going to be in North Carolina. He's there today with J.D. Vance, talking specifically, they say, about the issue of national security, though if we've learned our lesson from previous experiences, we may drift into other subject matter as well. But how should we think about his time spent in North Carolina now that we are seeing polling actually shifting in that swing state? Zabido's crystal ball moved it from lean czar to toss-up yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, we started this campaign saying there were going to be 7 key states that would decide this election, and probably a dozen counties in each one. And we're right back to where we started. And by the way, same ones from 2020. I mean, this reset of this election is looking eerily like 2020, and in all states, not just North Carolina. But I would point out, too, this is the first major rally outdoors that Donald Trump's done since he got shot. And so, you know, there's a little more mystique around this. And secondarily, he's been on message for a whole week now. I mean, he's really kind of taken the talking points that his campaign's given him to contrast nicely with the convention, even went out of his way to say nice things about Barack Obama last night or yesterday afternoon before the show. So there's something going on in the Trump campaign. And I think today is a very important turning point to see how his crowd is and how he handles it. He'll be in a bulletproof box on that stage. And a performer like Donald Trump, that could really have a salutary effect on his ability to turn that crowd on.
That's a really good point, Kaylee. We had seen reports earlier, and now we know for a fact the Secret Service has positioned ballistic glass around the country so they can have him protected on 3 sides, which does make the speech much more of a challenge.
Yeah, and I wonder how he will allude to the attempted assassination that we saw on the eve of the Republican convention as he counter-programs this Democratic one. We'll, of course, bring you anything noteworthy he says here on Bloomberg TV and radio and get analysis from our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Thank you both. We'll see you later. And we're about to see now Abigail Doolittle up in New York with another check on the markets. How are we looking, Abigail?
Well, stocks are hanging on to their small gains at this point, Kaylee and Joe. Earlier, we had some flip-flopping to small losses, but we're looking at another low-volume day. Really wait and see. And I think that the big thing that investors are looking for, they may be enjoying the DNC, but they're really waiting on the Fed and Jerome Powell, head of the Federal Reserve, his keynote speech in Jackson Hole on Friday. So right now we are looking at the S&P 500 slightly higher, but this comes after lots of volatility because we've had the S&P 500 over the last 12 days up 10 of those days, but over the last 30 days still down a little bit. And that has to do with that basic correction that we had into the month of August. So lots of uncertainty. A piece of this, of course, is that Fed liquidity, also having to do with the yen. We had the yen strengthening when stocks were going down. The yen stabilized a little bit, and now we are in this trend of stocks going higher. But I would say we are mainly in a period of volatility. And of course, election 2024 plays a big piece of this. The betting odds between Kamala Harris, VP Harris, and former President Donald Trump, well, they've narrowed. This is really interesting. So prior to Kamala Harris being the official pick, Donald Trump was somewhere at 70%. Kamala Harris was closer to 10%. And then she leapfrogged higher. But Donald Trump had still been bettering her. And then Kamala Harris pulled ahead of Donald Trump by nearly 20 percentage points now. And it's interesting that this is coming during DNC week. Now it's narrowed to about 8%. But the biggest takeaway from this is we don't know what's happening in November until November is over. Lots of uncertainty, different policies. So investors really, taking note of this. So if we check in on the Harris trade and also the Trump trade, the Harris trade for the most part is higher. D.R. Horton, that home builder who caters to first-time home builders at a record high, up about 3.8%. First Solar, we don't know that she's necessarily pro-green, but I'm assuming she'll probably be pro-green, up 1.3%. So that's positive, really supporting the Harris trade. On the other hand, it's interesting, Kroger, after falling for a couple days, really supporting the idea that her economic idea that maybe prices should be capped, that $1.7 trillion plan for all these different ideas. Today, we have Kroger bouncing back, investors saying not so much. And then it's really interesting, Joe, today and again during DNC week, we have Trump Media and Technology Group, DJT, surging up 14%, the best day in more than a month. So never a dull moment. Stay tuned. We'll be watching this news and what it means for the markets all week.
All right, Abigail, we thank you once again. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle with her eyes on the markets for us on Balance of Power. We're live in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention and keeping our focus as well on what's happening in Jackson Hole, where Bloomberg's Michael McKee is spending his week and joins us now with more, working our way up to the big speech on Friday. Michael, it's great to see you here. We're, of course, at the DNC, where a big part of the conversation has been turning the page, a new chapter as we work our way to the big speech from Kamala Harris on Thursday. You have your own version of that in Jackson Hole with Powell's speech on Friday. and another turning of a page. Will he open the new chapter when it comes to interest rate policy this week?
Well, I don't think he necessarily opens a new chapter, but he'll signal that it is coming, and it is probably coming in September. They have three more important reports, 2 inflation numbers and a jobs report before their next meeting on September 18th. So he may not want to lock the Fed into it at this point, but especially after today's number with the revisions downward to the non-farm payrolls report, it does suggest the economy is a little slower than the Fed had anticipated. That just adds weight to the idea that the Fed is ready to cut rates and probably will do so in September.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Mike. This is the biggest downward revision in payrolls we've seen since 2009, 818,000 lower in the 12 months through March. The thing is, this is backward-looking data, right? We're looking back through March. It's now August. They're making decisions about where they think we'll be in September. So how much does this really factor in?
Doesn't factor in all that much. It does suggest that the economy was creating fewer jobs. The labor market was a little less tight than the Fed had thought. But on average, we went from 242,000 jobs a month to 174,000. And 174,000 is still a solid number. It's above the number that the Fed would consider sort of neutral for job creation. So they still have a strong economy, just not as strong as they thought it was. Probably about 68,000 a month lower. But remember, this is all dependent on the next quarter's report, because this 818,000 will be revised again in January. And so the Fed is not going to put too much weight on it.
Mm-hmm. Michael, we spent some time yesterday with Heather Boucher, who's here in Chicago in her own personal capacity to act as a surrogate for Kamala Harris. And we asked her what would be the state of the economy, no matter who wins, when the next president takes office next year. She spoke to strength. What does the Fed see?
I think the Fed sees essentially the same. We will get new economic projections from Fed officials once we get to that September 18th meeting. But at the moment, they see GDP growth of about 2.1%. We're running a little ahead of that. Unemployment at 4.1%. We've jumped over that. And now the question is, do they raise their unemployment forecasts as well? And inflation is still coming down. So overall, if you were to project out, you would say it's a relatively strong economy. One thing that today's revisions show, though, is that post-pandemic, it's really hard to get a read on the economy that you know is going to be accurate. So it's a matter of risk containment for the Fed as they go forward.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, Michael McKee, as you're out there in Jackson Hole, we're here in Chicago, where we're asking a lot of people about the economic policies of these candidates and also this notion that they may approach Fed independence differently. Donald Trump doubling down again and speaking to Bloomberg's Mark Niquette this week on his suggestion that the president should at least be free to talk about monetary policy, even if the Fed doesn't necessarily heed that advice. Is that a conversation that's going to bleed into, if not the speeches in Jackson Hole, the dining room talk?
Not too much, because we've been through this before. Donald Trump was president, and Donald Trump did castigate the Fed, and Donald Trump did insult Jay Powell on a fairly regular basis for a while, and the Fed just went about its business and paid no attention. So I think that's what they'll do. And if we see that if Trump were to get elected, say, and there's some concern about it, the Fed would ramp up its behind-the-scenes lobbying. But Powell does a lot of that already, and I don't think the Fed's too worried that it would get through Congress unless there was some sort of huge Republican sweep.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael McKee coming to us live from a gorgeous Jackson Hole. Thank you so much. Of course, the weather's been pretty nice here in Chicago, too, but we don't.
Yeah, we've been blessed. I just wish you'd wear the 10-gallon hat next time you came on.
Yeah. Mike, next time, come on and say howdy. We'll look forward to that. Of course, as we're here in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, it is worth pointing out that these conventions aren't just about the speeches. They also are about money, as they often serve as a fundraising push for the candidates. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has been crunching those numbers and is joining us now with more. Tyler.
Yeah, hey, Kaylee, one way to quantify this newfound energy that we're talking about with the Democratic ticket is to look at the fundraising numbers. We know the Harris campaign says that they raised a record $200 million in her first week as presumptive nominee back in July. And this newfound energy and bringing new voters into the fold is something that Democrats are going to keep hoping that they can capitalize on. You actually spoke about it with one strategist last hour on Balance of Power.
Which vision is more like the vision you want for the future of America? And I think they are so good at making that case to young voters in particular and voters of color who often feel disenfranchised by our politics. I think you are seeing a beautiful consolidation of the base of those two entities.
According to the Federal Election Commission, the Harris campaign raised $310 million in July. That's compared to $139 million for the Trump campaign. It's important to note the total numbers you're seeing for the Democratic ticket here include money raised when President Biden was still the presumptive nominee. Even so, when we just dig into those July numbers with Harris at the top of the ticket, her campaign says 60% of those donors were women. A Bloomberg analysis of campaign finance data finds female donors consistently giving more to Democratic campaigns over Republicans, but they only topped the majority of donors recently in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was on the top of the ticket. Joe and Kaylee, the next question is whether or not Democrats can sustain this momentum. The most recent numbers show us that the Harris campaign currently has about $50 million more when it comes to cash on hand compared with the Trump campaign. But as you both know, that money can run out pretty fast.
Well, that's for sure, Tyler. And we also know things have evolved a lot since Kamala Harris went to the top of the ticket. The narrative over the course of the spring and summer was the big whales, the big Wall Street investors breaking for Trump, the Ackmans, the Schwartzmans. What has changed, if anything, since Kamala Harris took the top of the ticket?
Right, and as we were watching that conversation, you'll recall that former President Trump actually visited Washington. He had that private meeting at the Business Roundtable, meeting with CEOs, discussing some pledges when it came to the corporate tax rate. For example, Bloomberg News had learned that he had pledged in that meeting cutting it from 21% to 20%. And now during this convention, we're starting to hear other proposals from Kamala Harris the opposite way when it comes to raising the corporate tax rate. But like you said, former President Trump really trying to gain some of these bigger name donors, Blackstone, Steve Schwartzman. However, a lot of other big donors and Democratic donors in the past are starting to line up behind Kamala Harris. That includes many of those in Hollywood, for example, that are reaching into their deep pockets to give to her.
Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall just outside the United Center here in Chicago. We thank you. Tyler will bring us inside the convention hall on the floor a bit later on the late edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Chicago. We're glad you're with us here on the Wednesday edition as we work our way up to night 3. And joining us now to continue the conversation, Pat Dennis, president of American Bridge 21st Century. Pat, welcome. It's good to see you here in Chicago. I hope your convention's going well. You've certainly been pulling in a lot of money. $200 million for American Bridge. And you're targeting 3 swing states that should not be a mystery to anybody who ever listens to this program.
Yes.
It's Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, suggesting that this is still about the blue wall?
Yeah, they're incredibly important, and it's not just now. This isn't the last 2 weeks play. We've been in these states, going back as far as 2020, 2022, and we've been focused there now. There are other states that are very important, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, now North Carolina. Yeah. But for us, those 3 states are critical.
Well, and certainly we've seen a lot of time and energy and resources already invested in those states by the campaign. But we were joined earlier on this program by Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman-Schultz of Florida, who said she's been telling everyone, don't sleep on Florida. She's suggesting that there actually is potentially a chance there. But if everybody's so focused on the other swing states, are we actually going to see the investment in a state like that from anyone, if not from American Bridge?
Well, for us, we're really focused on those 3 states, and we stay in our lane, and we don't change our plans at the last minute. But I don't think she's wrong about Florida. If you look at the Senate race in Florida, the polling average is closer there than it is for the swing state of Ohio in the Senate race. So that, shouldn't be happening. So the numbers are all topsy-turvy, but for us, it is stay focused, keep your eye on the prize, win those 3 states.
Is part of the strategy as well to force the other campaign to continue spending more in those states?
Yes, and you see they're starting to run into dilemmas there. Like they're spending in North Carolina, and North Carolina is sliding away from them. They need to figure out where to deploy these resources, but for us, it's just like, you know, we're going to be on the air here. We're going to be running these extremely effective ads with like real people, and they need to find a way to respond.
You reserve time just to block out the other campaign?
We reserve time when it makes the most sense to do it. We're generally not trying to take away other spots from them. We're just doing it wherever it's most efficient.
Well, so what's the message you bring? It's one thing to buy the time, but then you have to do something with it. What's most effective in these states?
Yeah, so our ads are real people who are, you know, we find on the ground in the states, some of whom even voted for Trump, and basically telling their stories and what issues are important to them. Abortion is a very key one. Democracy in like a broad sense, not just January 6th, although we include January 6th, but just the importance of our institutions and freedom, which, you know, you see a lot of this convention as a major theme. Freedom, the ability to live the kind of life you want to live, have the kind of family you want to have. Like these messages are really resonating.
I'm fascinated by the anatomy of making a political ad. You just described your style. If you're going to be using real people as opposed to actors or archival tape, you could do so many different things these days with technology. How do you bring them to the point of being able to deliver that message? How do you coordinate that production?
It is a lot of work, and we don't write scripts. We don't
script them.
We don't tell them what to say. We go to their house, literally, and sit down and chat, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2 hours, and cut it together into an ad. Now, if you ever get into the business of making political ads, I tell you, this is the most expensive and hardest and most stressful way to do it, but it's also the most effective. You know, real people, and you got to go find them, you got to talk to them, they have to be bought in. So,
and then you add the music and all the other elements after you get that conversation.
Indeed, but the core of it is just face-to-face discussion.
So does that make it more about the issues than the actual personalities to a large extent? Because it seems that the ads we've seen thus far from the campaigns are all about Kamala Harris. From Donald Trump, it's attacks. From her, it's defining her. But they are about them as people by and large.
Yeah, and we're pretty focused on the issues. Abortion, you know, it is impossible to get away from. It is something that gets into people's lives. They have real stories. We have folks, you know, telling very difficult stories of starting their families on TV, and that is just a real issue that transcends personality in a lot of ways.
A lot of the ads we've seen from the Trump campaign have been pretty dark, and I mean that literally. They're darker images, grainy video, as he tries to paint the image of a nation in decline. How do those poll? Does that test well?
I think they like it. That's sort of their mood right now, especially you see his social media usage. He's in a dark place. In our world, like, it is not that effective. People see those and they say, oh, political ad, next. It's not compelling, it's negative, it turns people off. So that's how we see it, at least.
So are you going all in on just ads, or are you going to do, you know, door knocking efforts trying to turn out the vote? We've heard a lot, including from the Obamas last night, about how you got to channel enthusiasm, and certainly the only way to do that isn't just reaching people on their TV screens or on their phones.
For sure. For us, it is ads. We also do opposition research at American Bridge, but we work with partners across the ecosystem. We provide our research, we provide our polling, we work together, and some of those are doing incredibly effective work on the ground. So,
how do you spend your time while you're here at the convention? This is also, people see speeches on TV. This is a massive fundraiser this week, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm going around, I'm talking to people. I am way overbooked. I am very sleepy.
Thank you for sharing some of your time with us.
Exactly. Going to parties. It's, you know, it's a convention.
Well, and it feels kind of like a party. Everybody who's come in here on set has been in a great mood. Granted, people were in a pretty good mood in the Republican convention in Milwaukee. Also, everybody was feeling really good about their candidate, just as we're sensing here. It raises the question, though, of complacency, and I feel like we've heard this alluded to by the Obamas and others, this notion that you can't take it for granted that it's always going to be like this. Do you have that concern as you're talking to people here in Chicago, that maybe there's some rose-colored glass situations going on?
I thought Michelle Obama said it best, right? If you're scrolling on the phone, put it down and do something. People here, you know, the people who are in the convention hall are the most important people to do that message. The people who are going to be out there knocking on doors, you know, talking to their neighbors. And I think that message is really getting out there. You know, get off the phone, don't panic, do the work, win the election. It is not in the bag for us, but we have a path to win this thing, and we're going to do it.
Because we mentioned Michelle Obama, there have been some questions about the language she chose in what was a pretty poetic speech. I think we can agree. She talked about magic in the air, a familiar feeling that's been buried too deep for far too long, the contagious power of hope. What does that suggest has been going on the last 3 years?
Well, I mean, if you look at the 2020 election, it was completely different. You know, we were locked down in COVID. We were coming out of these dark Trump years. And Joe Biden came in and he talked about passing the torch to the next generation, being a bridge. He talked about why he got into the race. But we've been, you know, he's been dragging us out of those really dark Trump years. And I think it's been important work. Extremely thankful. You know, the legislation we passed, right? The CHIPS Act, bringing jobs back to the United States, high-tech jobs, you know, some of the climate work he did. It's all been incredible. But now you see we're in a bit of a happier place and we can, you know, really start talking about hope again.
Or joy, in the words of Tim Walz. He's thanked Kamala Harris for, in his words, bringing that back. And of course, we're going to hear from Governor Walz tonight as he makes his acceptance speech. Pat Dennis of American Bridge 21st Century, making time for us in a very busy week. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always good to have you. And of course, it's been a busy week, certainly, for the ticket themselves, as Tim Walz and Harris were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin yesterday, came back late last night. And now Tim Walz is certainly, almost certainly, in high prep mode for his big speech.
Hunkered down with the speechwriters and rehearsing things. You'll, of course, see that hear it live on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've got some important news, by the way, for our Bloomberg radio audience in New England. It's a pleasure to tell you that starting September 3rd, you can listen to Bloomberg Radio in and around Boston on our new signal, our new home, 92.9 FM. Your news source for business news from the financial center of New England. Bloomberg Radio moving to 92.9 FM at noon. That's the day after Labor Day. And really great to do that, hearing from a lot of fun friends up in Boston today. Kaylee, with that news.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And of course, being the day after Labor Day, that also kind of represents that final sprint.
You said it.
Toward November. That's when election season really gets going. Of course, it's already going here in Chicago, and we'll have more coverage of that in the late edition of Balance of Power, live from the DNC. That's 5 p.m. Wall Street time. And we'll have some special guests coming up. We also have a conversation later this afternoon with Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City.
Yeah, much more to follow. Keep it right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.